Welcome back. In today's episode of Great Ideas from Around the World, we're going to hear a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. On Christmas Eve, the 24th of December, 1967, Dr. King gave a speech entitled A Christmas Sermon on Peace, the Trumpet of Conscience. In his speech, he said, "And the leaders of the world today talk eloquently about peace. Every time we drop our bombs in North Vietnam, President Johnson talks eloquently about peace. What is the problem? They are talking about peace as a distant goal, as an end we seek. But one day we must come to see that peace is not merely a distant goal we seek, but it is a means by which we arrive at that goal. We must pursue peaceful ends through peaceful means." It's the end of that quote that I really want to talk about today, when he says, we must pursue peaceful ends through peaceful means. Of course, we don't live in the future. We live in an imperfect present. No matter who you are and no matter what society you live in, you can find problems with that society. You could find problems with your government, with your culture, with the predominant belief system, whatever it is. None of us live in a perfect society. And so we're faced with this question. If we are going to improve it so that everyone is better off, do we gradually improve our society, hosting debates, reasoning things out, and allowing for the slow democratic process to take place? Or do we demand change now and force that change through violence, riots, death, destruction of property, etc., etc.? Do we force the peace we want? Well, perhaps we can compare this question to the kind of situation we face in a relationship. If you really care about someone and you hope that they share that affection with you, do you force them to share that affection with you, or do you slowly try to build the relationship and hope that everything turns out in your favor? If we look at it as far as relationships, forcing someone to do anything is abhorrent and repugnant. But when we talk about societies, we often say, well, yeah, sometimes it is justified to force a society to be better. I feel like how we treat our society and how we treat another person that we care about really aren't that different. And we shouldn't distance those schools of thought so far away from each other. That's just my take. I argue that the moral way 99% of the time is to bring about peace through peaceful means. I say 99% because there is always a slim category of circumstances in which any moral person can justify violence. For example, if you are alone in a dark alley, right? This is the easy example we all can come up with. And you are mugged by a gang of people who are stronger than you, perhaps armed with knives. There are no police around. There's no higher authority you can call upon. You want to keep your money. Of course, they want all your money and your jewelry and whatever. Perhaps your loved ones are in danger, too, in this scenario. If you're armed and you face that situation with violence, I doubt that anyone in the comments of this video or anyone watching this would say that that's unjustified. Because you're defending your life. You're protecting your right to property, which is less important, but perhaps only slightly so. However, we do come across different philosophies around the world that would say that protecting your own life, your right to live, is not itself grounds for violence. We see that in some Buddhist teachings. We see that in Sikhism. One of the Sikh gurus, for example, would rather be beheaded than lift a finger against the warring groups around him. Of course, in Christianity, we see that. We see that with, Jesus Christ's self-sacrifice and the self-sacrifice of the early martyrs and leaders of Christendom. So the idea that even in this situation, someone would rather die isn't a new idea. It's an idea that we find all over the place. In my perspective, the right to live is worth fighting for at that moment. The timing is very important. If your life is in danger in a particular moment, then in that moment, violence is justified. But now we've entered into a very dark and slippery room. Right now we're occupying the mind space of some of the most dangerous and some of the most corrupt and some of the most harmful ideologies in the history of mankind. This is a very bloody path to go down. All causes and movements that promote violence claim to be in this 1%. They claim to be the exception to the rule. They claim to be the one case in which violence is justified. They blur the lines between fact and belief and always claim that they are acting in self-defense. It's pretty easy to see this. If you look at the literature of the early Nazi movement, if you look in the speeches given by jihadists and extremists and people who believe that peace can only come through the subjugation of the infidel and things like that. If you look at the communist revolutions, I have yet to find a devastatingly evil cause in history that was not justified in some way in the minds of the people as some sort of self-defense. So, although self-defense makes sense, like in the example I gave, it's also used so often. With enough charismatic leaders and speeches, anything can be justified. Therefore, we should be suspicious of anyone who makes these claims. Even the example I gave, is violence really the only way out of that situation? I think it is, but I could be wrong. And we should always be suspicious of people who claim that their one true position is the only one that can justify violence. Perhaps they claim to be the biggest victims. Perhaps they claim to be the most righteous cause. Whatever the case, we should be insatiably suspicious. If we pursue peace through violent means, the opposite of what Dr. Martin Luther King advises, then we immediately become hypocrites and frauds. We immediately say that violence is wrong because we want peace. So let's use the most wrong thing, the antithesis of our belief. Let's use that to get what we want. And of course, people who are against the death penalty make that argument too. They say, if we're against murder and death, why are we using murder and death to punish murder and death? And I'm not going into that debate. To be honest, I'm not always sure what to think about that debate. But it's a similar case here. The argument is similar. When we pursue peace through violent means, we employ that might makes right, or outrage makes right. We say that, well, we're the most outraged, we're the strongest, and we're going to force what should happen. Perhaps there's also a call to say that, well, we are in the majority. If we're the strongest, then we're in the majority, then we're right. And one obvious problem with that line of thinking is that anyone who comes after you can claim the exact same thing. If you have established a peaceful society after claiming the most land and after destroying your rivals and after building the largest army, then all it takes is a few years later for someone else to do the same thing. Overthrow you, take over more land, destroy your armies with their superior army. And that doesn't make them right. They can claim it as though, because they say, well, we're in self-defense. We have to protect our ideology or whatever. You can see that this argument is just never ending. And it's the most barbarous of solutions. It's basic. All we have to do is look at the most selfish and unprincipled toddlers and see how they solve problems. Well, they bite each other, they hit each other, they scratch each other, and therefore through violence they get what they want. It's not a creative solution. It's not a patient solution. It's not a solution that requires any amount of higher thinking. And it's the cliche bully tactic. It actively increases the amount of suffering and death in the world, so how can we call it moral? How can we call building a future of peace off of violence moral at all? With all that in mind, let's go back to the example of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Did he have justification for self-defense? Did the black community in the United States at the time have a justification for self-defense? I would argue, of course they did. I believe that they had mountains of justification. The society in which he lived was demonstrably unjust. We can look and see the black and white laws on the books that call for different treatment of people based upon their skin color. This is obviously unjust and immoral. And African Americans of that age were subject to tremendous and terrible acts of violence, including murder. So if they were to organize and aim to overthrow this regime that is murdering their citizens, I would say he was completely justified. But here's the point. He advocated peaceful protest. He advocated marches in which they would sing songs about freedom, peace, brotherly love, things like that. He was about as Christian as you could get. No, he chose the higher road. This is why he was a great man and a leader. Even though he and his followers could justify a violent path to peace, peace has to be the way to make peace happen. Peace must come by peaceful means. Peace must come through peaceful means. This is what was advocated by Dr. Martin Luther King, and I think should be advocated by everyone who is trying to live a moral life and bring about a more moral society. When we have reason, when we have logic, when we have open discussion and open debate, there is no room for fist fighting. This is the higher road. This is why he was one of the greatest men and the greatest leaders and the greatest people who had ever lived, in my opinion. But that's just my opinion. I really want to know what you think about the different topics discussed today, and I really appreciate you joining me today. Please subscribe to get daily great ideas from around the world, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.